Okay, now we talked about memory being, as the information processing model as a three-stage process. You have the encoding process, storage, and retrieval. So you're bringing the information in, storing it, and then retrieving it to be able to use it again. Well, we need to now talk about encoding. We need to talk about the encoding storage, and we need to talk about it in terms of three different, according to the Atkinson Shiffrin model, there are three different ways of storing memory, three different storage places, if you want to put it that way. Now, there's your sensory memory, there's your short-term memory, and there's your long-term memory. And information that ends up stored in your long-term memory has to first go through your sensory memory and then be stored in your short-term memory before it can finally get to your long-term memory. So it's kind of like a three-step process too, but they're kind of like three storage spaces if you want to look at it that way. So let's summarize this. As I said, so it's a process. It's not just three areas of storage. It's a process. You store it in sensory memory, and then it goes to short-term memory, then finally long-term memory. Basically, your sensory memory, you need to be able to, once you store something in your sensory memory, you need to be able to pay attention to it. You pay attention to a small part of what you're storing. Then what you pay attention to, you now store in your short-term memory, process it here in your short-term memory. Once it's in your short-term memory, then you can further encode it into your long-term memory. And as I was saying before, the same rules go. If you encode deeply, using elaboration properly, then you're going to be likely to keep it stored in your long-term memory, perhaps indefinitely. And then you then be able to retrieve it once you've got, remember you talked about the different cues that you have for triggering that memory, you'll be able to retrieve this information. Now, in order for the short-term memory to work, you need to be able to be rehearsing it, or else you're going to forget it pretty quickly. So the short-term memory doesn't last that long. You got to rehearse it to keep it in your memory long enough before you can then encode it into your long-term memory. So let's start with the sensory memory. What is sensory memory? Sensory memory is very detailed information. Basically, with your sensory memory, you actually remember everything in its original sensory form. You are, especially when we get to the topic of sensation and perception, we have sense organs, regarding hearing and vision and whatnot that allow us to take in information from the environment and process this information. We essentially receive this information, and then once we receive it, then we need to process it. Well, the sensory memory is kind of that first step process. You are receiving this information from the environment, and now at this stage you need to then move it on to the next level. But the sensory memory is a very brief duration. What you are picking up, you're picking up everything that you're seeing and hearing, but it doesn't last very long. You forget it very quickly unless you pay attention. And you can't pay attention to everything. When you open your eyes, you see a whole lot of different things. You can only pay attention to a small amount of the stimuli you were exposed to. But you take in all this information in your sensory memory, but just about for a very short time. Two categories of sensory memory are echoic memory, which is auditory, the stuff you hear, and the iconic or visual memory, which is what you see. And the echoic memory only lasts maybe 2 to 3 seconds. The iconic memory can kind of last even maybe 1 second or less. It doesn't last very long at all. Now, as I mentioned before, the attention. You need to select something from your sensory memory to pay attention to. You're getting bombarded with stimuli all the time. You can't pay attention to everything. We're not physiologically equipped to do so. You can only pay attention to a small amount of information that we come in contact with. So, we pay attention to this information, and then when we pay attention to this information, with the purpose of trying to store it into our next phase, into our short-term memory, to try to then maybe see what we want to do with this information. Do we want to use it just temporarily, or do we want to store it for a long period of time? So let's talk about short-term memory. Now, sensory memory, as I said before, is a very short duration. Only a few seconds for hearing, and maybe even less than a second for vision. It does not last long. Okay? See everything, hear everything, but it's all gone very quickly. Short-term memory does have a longer duration than sensory memory, but it still also doesn't last that long. Maybe it lasts about 30 seconds. So, and furthermore, there's a limited capacity. So not only does it not last long, there is also a limited amount of information you can put once. Remember, I'm saying you pay attention to something that comes from your sensory memory, and you have to then, you can only pay attention to a small amount of information. Likewise, if you're trying to keep information in your short-term memory, you can only work with information, keep it in your short-term memory, if it has like 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of information. Okay? So, if you think about it as an example here, how many of you have looked up a number in the phone book, a phone number, and on your way from the phone book to the phone, you forget the number? Well, what's going on here? Your phone number, it kind of within that, it kind of reaches kind of the edge of the capacity, because the phone number is 7 pieces of information, it's 7 numbers. So you're kind of at the edge of what you can easily remember in your short-term memory. Furthermore, it may take you more than 30 seconds to get to the phone and pick up the phone and start dialing, and you may be distracted by something else on the way, and you might lose that memory. You might forget what it is you just looked up. That can be very frustrating. But basically, to remember, you got to, if you're going to keep it in your short-term memory, you've got to rehearse it. So the best way to remember a number from the phone book to the phone is maybe repeat the number to yourself over and over again to make sure that you're rehearsing it, keeping it in your short-term memory. But if phone numbers were 20 digits long, there's no way we'd be able to remember it from the phone book to the phone. It's very difficult to remember information if it's that long. It's beyond our capacity. So keep that in mind. There's a limited amount of information that you can effectively store in your short-term memory. And again, as I was saying, rehearsal, repeating the information over and over again, processing it over and over again in your short-term memory will keep it in your short-term memory in case you want to either use it right away or move it into your long-term memory to use later. Now, an alternative model to the concept of short-term memory. The concept of a short-term memory indicates this small box where you would keep the memories and play with it for a while, and you rehearse it over and over again until you need to take this information and put it into a next box. But according to a different model of memory, you have these 3 components here. You have a central executive that kind of is the master of the process of what you're doing. And the concept of working memory, think about that in terms of, it's like looking at memory as something that you are manipulating, something that you are working with. It's not just something that's just sitting there. It's dynamic. You are using this information, processing it yourself. And one way you're processing it is processing it visually, visualizing it, drawing it out like a sketch pad, like an artist. You're drawing it out, a picture of what it is you're trying to remember. Okay? The phonological loop, you're paying attention to the sound of what it is you are trying to remember. So the sound of the words. So you're paying attention to both the sound of it as well as how it looks visually. Meanwhile, your central executive is processing this information both visually and phonologically. And it's all, again, interactive. So in other words, your sensory memory, and don't forget, if you sensory memory, some of your echoic memory is probably going directly into your phonological loop. Your iconic memory, which is visual, going directly into that sketch pad. So it allows, and then your central executive is processing all this information together, which would then, if you wanted to use this information for a longer time, then encode it into your long-term memory. So now going back to the Atkinson-Shiffrin model, the short-term memory, you are encoding the short-term memory into your long-term memory, and again, you can call this memorizing. You're keeping it stored in your long-term memory for an extended period of time. Basically, long-term memory more or less lasts as long as you live. So in other words, you're trying to keep it in your long-term memory, keep it for a long time, at least long enough for the test. But once it's stored in long-term memory, in order to be able to use it, you need to retrieve it, and that's the remembering of what it is you memorized. So if you've stored it and you can't retrieve it, then you're not going to be able to use it. So you need to be able to retrieve it in order to be able to use the information for a task, be it dialing a number, be it answering a multiple choice question on an exam. You need to be able to retrieve the information from your long-term memory and be able to use it. So let's talk a little bit about your long-term memory. Long-term memory is relatively permanent. Obviously, there are still things you can forget, but nevertheless, it's relatively permanent with basically an unlimited capacity. I have to use unlimited. Maybe we don't even really know how much. I'm sure there is a limit, but we haven't figured out what that limit is. It's a lot of information you can check in school.